So let's say you know how to play all your open chord shapes, and let's say you know how to play all your standard bar chord shapes up and down the neck. And then you ask, is that it? What if you wanted to be able to play chords anywhere on the fretboard at any moment, maybe even in the middle of a solo? There's a trick that great guitar players around the world do all the time. And without this trick, playing chords just anywhere is pretty difficult. But with this trick, playing chords anywhere is pretty easy. So here's a quick demo of how this concept is going to sound. Now I have A, D, A, D, A, D, So how can we find chords anywhere up and down the neck at a moment's notice? We can do it the hard way, which is by knowing all the notes in each chord. Like for example, an A chord is A, C sharp, E, and then knowing where A, C sharp, E is on the fretboard and its inversions, which would be like E, C sharp, A, and knowing them in that order on the fretboard. But that's really hard. It takes a lot of brain work. And then we can do it the easy way, which is memorizing chord shapes, as we all do. As guitar players, we're always memorizing chord shapes. But in this case, we need a landmark so that we can find A or D or E in whatever shape. Let me explain. Let's take an easy one, A. I mean, you all know this A. It's open position A. Sometimes we call this cowboy A or campfire A, right? But in fact, campfire A, as you've probably figured out at some point in your guitar development, is also becomes a bar chord, right? Those bigger chords are not always that useful in the middle of a solo, but we can shrink the chords down into little pieces. For example, just those three notes. Those three notes are very quick and easy to play, and the smaller sound of them and the smaller nature of them can sound better in the middle of a solo, or sound better in certain kind of rhythm guitar playing where you don't always want to be smashing big chords all the time, right? So if I know instantly that that's a D, again, the hard way would be to know, well, the root of that D chord is the middle note of those three notes that I'm playing. That's not that hard if you're really good at knowing the notes on the G string, but I know most of my students are not that good at knowing the notes on the G string. However, if you get really good at learning the notes on just the low E and the A string, you can use those notes as landmarks to find whatever chords you need, even if you're not even playing any notes on those strings. So for example, this chord, many of my students know this chord is a D chord, not because that's a D, but because this is a D here. We call it like a landmark. We're not actually playing it, but it's like saying, well, the library is just 2 doors down from the corner store, right? So we don't need to play the whole chord, we can just play that guy. And there's a D major chord, or an E major chord, or a G chord, or whatever. Why is this a G chord? Because that's a G note right there, right? We just visual it like that. So we're going to do 3 different shapes. This one you may have already played, and you may have already figured out how to find it. We're going to do the 2 other inversions. An inversion just means we're changing the order of the notes. So an A chord might be here, it might be here, it might be here. Each of these chords is still the same group of notes. It's still A, C sharp, E, but we're changing the order of them. And this one is actually what we would call root position, because this bottom note is A, C sharp, E. But how do I find this chord quickly? How do I know instantly this is A if I don't know right away that the note at the 7th fret of the D string is an A? You can find it because your landmark, A, can be here on the E string, the low E. Another way to think of it is you can just think of it as it's just a part of this big standard bar chord shape, right? But we don't need to play the big standard bar chord shape because we don't always want to, right? So there's the A shape there. So now we have this A shape, and we have this A shape. And we can use those. I can go from here, I could play some, say, A major pentatonic, which would be right here. look at how nicely that A fits in there, right? Now, I just happen to find myself around the 5th, 6th, 7th frets, and I think, well, what's my A around there? What's this one? Because, why? Because of this landmark. Sure, I could play this big bar chord, but it's not as cool in the middle of a solo, right? Sometimes you just want to hit. We can go back and forth. It's that big country. Or we can just use them as strumming, even if we are just playing rhythm guitar as rhythm guitar players in a song. Maybe this A gets a bit boring, right? That's a pretty nice A. That's a pretty nice A. Now let's find our third inversion. The third inversion is actually kind of the hardest one. It's the hardest one to play, but it's well worth it because it's such a cool sounding inversion and it's in lots of songs and it's connected to a really great major pentatonic shape. So it's worth the study. So bear with me if this one is a little hard for you, but here it is. We can play these 3 notes just like that. In this case, we have C sharp, and then we have E, and then we have A. The root's on the top. But again, that's the hard way to think of it. Most of my students don't know that that's the order of these notes here. They're just thinking about the landmark. So the landmark is here in this case. The landmark is that A root. That A is at the 12th fret of the A string. Of course, that's A. We could think of this, if we were into the caged system, we might call this the C shape of A, because it actually kind of looks like cowboy C, right? I mean, I don't really play that shape. That's pretty hard. I just play that. Plus, again, it's smaller, and sometimes smaller is going to sound better in the middle of a solo. So now we have 3 A chords. We have A, back to A. That was all A. So if you had a song that had a lot of A, doesn't happen too often, but maybe you got a song that's got like 8 bars of A or more. Well, you can keep the A chord very interesting just by moving to a different inversion. And when you move to the different inversion, you need to play the different pentatonic shape that's in that area. So in this one, it's actually our easy shape. No problem, right? When we move to this one, it's the extension shape, I call it, right? So the top 3 strings are just this. Some people call that the box. And we looked at that quite a bit in one of my other recent videos. You can use this A chord inversion as a launch. And then this one is what pentatonic shape? Is this one. I call that the funny B string shape. Just because the B string gets pitched up a fret, right? So you can practice going through the inversion. Come in. And you can practice those inversions with your accompanying major pentatonic shape. So the system works like this. The main thing is you've got to think ahead. So let's say you're soloing here in this extension box. And you think ahead, you look down and you say, I need an A chord. So step 2 is you look at your E and your A strings and you ask yourself, well, where is an A root nearby? Maybe there's one right nearby. In this case, there is. There's an A right there. Step 3 is you just ask yourself, well, what's my inversion chord that landmark gives me? And in this case, it gives me this one, right? So let's take the system to the next step. We can use this system to easily change chords at any moment in the middle of a solo along with the chords of the song, because of course the chords in the song are not always A. They are more likely to be something like 1 chord to 4 chord, A major to D major in this case, right? So if I'm on my A chord here, let's say, let's find a D chord. Again, we just use the system. We take a moment to think ahead. We think we need a D chord, okay. And then we look down and we look at our E and A strings and we find a D root. Okay, there's one right there. Because we have studied and memorized the notes on our E and A strings very well, right? So there's our D root, and we see that D root. We don't necessarily play that D root. We don't need to play it. We're just going to play the cool little inversion that we have, right? So let's go back to A. D. There it is, right? And then, now this is getting more complicated, but then we got to visualize what is D major pentatonic right there. Well, whenever we have this shape, it's the easy pentatonic shape. Back to A. D. Let's do E. Well, it would be the same, right? Because my E landmark is right there. Or another way to think of it is 5 chord is always 2 frets above the 4 chord, right? D. But that's in an easier area. We want to be able to do these wherever we are at the moment, right? So let's explore the other areas. If I'm here on A, and I want a D, I look down, I see, oh, I have a D right here on the A string. Okay, that means that my D triad inversion is there. So I go in A. It sounds so good just to hit that chord. You don't even need to play anything after that if you didn't want to. It sounds so cool, right? We did this one already, A to D. So now we have A to D, A to D. Let's do this one, A. Look down, where's your D root now? Oh, it's there. I'm not gonna bother playing that D root, I don't want it. I just want the little triad inversion there, right? So I'm here, A. D. Yeah. That's from my incredible chord scale connector video, right? Whenever you see this shape, you can play that, right? So we go back to A. D. What a nice little transition. It's so simple. It feels like it barely moves, and yet we really hear that harmonic change. I love it from that. Let's go back to the bottom. D. You can keep the A below. I'm keeping that open A on the whole time as well. A is in a D chord as well, so it works, right? Now I have A, D, A, D, A, D, A, D. And I should be clear. I'm not saying that you don't ever need to memorize all the notes on the fretboard. It is very useful to know instantly that that's an A. It can provide you with all kinds of really quick, great ideas when you're soloing. But I know that from teaching for all these years, my students, they might not be at the level yet in which knowing all the notes on the fretboard is really that useful, because they're still navigating a lot of other things. And so that's why using this landmark system is often better. And truth be told, even though I know instantly that that's an A note, I'm not always using that information to find what I need. Sometimes in certain situations, the landmark is still faster and easier, because when I see the landmark, it opens up the entire chord shape and scale shape. So just remember, whatever key you're in or whatever chord you need at any moment, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be 1, 4, 5. It could be any major chord in this case, because we haven't done minor chord shapes. But any major chord, you just think ahead. While you're soloing, you could be noodling a little bit. You think ahead, you say, what is this next chord coming up? And you look down, you find the root on either the E or the A, and you have to study these shapes. And once you've studied these shapes just start to appear, right? So if you need a G chord, here's a G chord. I know that's a G chord. Well, I know that's a G chord because I know that's a G too. But I know that's a G chord because that's a G chord. It's the whole thing. And then the whole thing opens up for you, and you can play G chords wherever you need them at any moment. So if you haven't already seen that other video called The Incredible Chord Scale Connector, check that one out, because that one's kind of a precursor to this one. This one expands on those ideas. And now we've actually covered basically these 3 inversions, which are your 3 major inversions on those strings, and connected them with the major pentatonic shapes. And I will see you next Saturday.